backup for that. So hopefully it doesn't. So yes, good morning, everyone. Today's topic is leadership in an age of upheaval. Um, in terms of the brief outline for the webinar, I'm going to be doing a quick introduction into myself. Some of you may have heard this introduction before, because this is the fourth in a series of 4 webinars that we've done over the past few weeks. And then I'll do a bit of a topic outline and discussion, and then we'll go into some governance and imperatives thereafter, right towards the end. And then we'll take Q&A as well. So look forward to hearing from you during the course of the webinar and towards the end. So, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of a short introduction about myself, your facilitator for this morning, I run a firm called B2H ICT Advisory. We're based here in Sandton in Johannesburg, and we work largely at board level with organizations in the public sector and in the private sector. A lot of mainly large organizations, in this instance, organizations such as the Reserve Bank, Auditor General, etc., and some fairly large, well-known brands as well, a lot of listed companies as well. And what we do is that we work at board level in terms of governance, guiding on strategy, and being able to effect solutions that the organization can drive from board level. So to a large extent, boards sometimes dial out of the process of understanding what happens regarding technology and strategy, especially technology, because they find that it sometimes tends to be too technical. And what happens is that we get called in to help guide organizations such as these, such that ownership is taken from the very top. So in terms of our little graphic that you see here, if you have a healthy board, you'll have a healthy company. That's absolutely true. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later on today as we conclude with the webinar. In terms of my personal background, I started out in PwC in audit and then joined their management advisory and consulting arm in Johannesburg. Initially, PwC's audit in Pietermaritzburg, and then the advisory and consulting firm in Johannesburg, and involved in a lot of very interesting projects on the strategy and operations side, operations management, etc., business process management, business process re-engineering. Thereafter, joined Eskom. This was back in the day when Eskom was still an energy utility. Right now, it's struggling to find its way back there. For a little while, it actually went into things such as family finance, etc., and was then hinted to by government and the general public that you're neglecting to generate electricity. So hopefully, they're starting to get this right with the new CEO coming in and cracking the whip. I must say that in his interview last week on 702, if you haven't heard that, it is streamed. So even if you don't listen to 702 wherever you are in the country, you can go onto the Eyewitness News website or the 702 website and stream that interview from with Ande Director, where Bruce Whitfield was talking to him about how he plans to turn around the organization. And he's already cracking the whip, taking responsibility from the top, turning around an organization that's actually in rather bad, it's in turmoil at the moment. And back in the day, Eskom actually ran technology very well. It ran as a utility very well. And back in 2000, 2001, it actually won the award for the world's best run energy utility. It's hard to believe that it's actually fallen so far from those lofty heights in such a short period of time. And hopefully it will one day get back there. I was responsible for helping to be part of the technology team that ran technology for Eskom. Eskom doesn't do small types of technology, it does large, it is industrial strength technologies. And I was privileged to have been part of a team that ran some of the most interesting and most comprehensive technology projects in the country, and perhaps even on the continent at the time. After Eskom, the government took a decision to take the technology divisions of Eskom, Transnet and Denel out of those companies and put it into a company called Arabia.com. And we were then supposed to sell services back to Eskom. That didn't go very well. I did my master's predicting it wouldn't last, and unfortunately it didn't. But there were very good reasons why it didn't, not the least of which being governance and leadership of that organization, but also that Arabia.com was formed at a time when the IT industry was actually hyper competitive as a result of the .com bubble bursting back in 1999, 2000, 2001. So the industry was in consolidation at the time. So strategically, it wasn't the right time to form that type of organization, but nevertheless, it had a case for being able to do what it ought to have done. It had a case for success, but it just couldn't execute properly. After my time at Harrier.com, I was asked to join Harmony Gold as the Group Chief Information Officer, which is where I spent almost 9 years of my life. It was a privilege to have worked in such an organization. If you haven't heard of Harmony Gold, it is now the world's third largest gold mining group, and it has some of the most valuable mining assets in the world in Southeast Asia. And it's listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, New York, London, and in Europe as well. So it's a company with a really fairly global footprint. It employs around about 30 to 40,000 people in South Africa. At the time when I joined, it employed about 60,000 people just in South Africa. And what made the time at Harmony very notable was that we got sued by our US shareholders for an ERP implementation that didn't go well. I was brought in at the time that they had started this project and advised the organization to stop it, and it couldn't, and it didn't, it refused to. And that was actually the beginning of a very interesting time where we had to turn things around. But it also resulted in huge governance upheaval, because it resulted in the CEO and a number of the exec having to leave the organization as a result of the board taking charge, because something had gone horribly wrong. There was governance failure. And indeed, what was supposed to have been a very, very simple, straightforward, but yet expensive ERP implementation of around about 100 million rand for the first phase ended up becoming a very, very expensive out-of-court settlement with our US shareholders, and then we had to turn these systems around. So that experience was extremely valuable in terms of my advising boards as we work now. I was one of the few CIOs globally to have reported to the main board of a listed organization. It was very, very valuable experience. Moving on from there to our webinar topic for today, leadership in an age of upheaval and changing before you have to. Now, the webinar series that we had created over the last few weeks culminates in a summary today of a few of the areas that we had covered. And we're going to talk a little bit about how technology has moved from being a disruptor to being a savior during COVID-19. And what we are now going to be moving into is what a post-COVID economy might look like, where the changes are likely to be coming from. But what happens now that this pandemic era has caused paranoia and angst? How do you manage? How do you strategize? How do you run your organizations in those types of environments? How do you take this forward into the future? What is this future likely to look like? And I'd like us to have a short discussion afterwards during Q&A. I'd love to hear your views on this as well as we move forward. And of course, some guidance from us in terms of a broad framework for governance and leadership. How do you take these things forward? And we're going to be covering two very interesting case studies in the form of Nokia and Boeing, and what had happened in those organizations as a result of not being able to change in time, not being able to listen to the signals from the marketplace and listening to their own people. As a result of that, these organizations, which were once leaders in their respective industries, are now struggling. Nokia, as you know, has now moved into a different business altogether from what it was before. It's still in the technology and telecommunications industry, but it no longer manufactures handsets that it was once famous for. And we'll talk a little bit about that and how that has come to be. So ladies and gentlemen, before we start with the first segment of the topic today, which is business disruption in a pandemic-driven world, I'm going to ask today to help to just start off the first poll. We're just going to take a first poll of how, it's a bit of a temperature check as well. And we're going to share those results with you. So Sujay, if you can please run the first poll. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. Here we go. So your first poll for today, COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on people's lives since the beginning of the year. Adapting has been difficult and frustrating. How do you feel right now about future prospects? So your two options there: unsure and uncomfortable, the future looks bleak, or still unsettled but cautiously optimistic about the future. So the polls are now open. Please, can you vote? It'll be interesting to hear what you have to say about this. And then in a short while, we're going to close the poll and we're going to share the results. So if you can please start your polling. How are we doing so far on the polls, Sujay?
I'm back, Marlon. So we've got about No problem. 72% have voted.
Excellent. So let's keep going, guys. There's a lot of participants today. We'd love to hear more from you. Um, and we're going to do a 10-second countdown, and then I'll start from 5 just now. So hopefully when we close the polls, we'll have a nice um, set of results to share with you. I'll go into 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Sarah, we can close it. And I'd like to share those results, please. Excellent. So, ladies and gentlemen, 19% say unsure and uncomfortable, the future looks bleak. And 81% say still unsettled, but cautiously optimistic about the future. Thank you very much for that. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think that, there's no right or wrong answer about how you feel right now. I think that in terms of where we are, the world that we're living in right now is we are living in unprecedented times. The 2020 will probably go down in history as being one of those most memorable defining moments in humanity's history on the planet. And if we look at almost exactly 100 years ago with the Spanish flu, the two world wars, and what we have actually lived through with the fall of the Berlin Wall, etc., and the ending of the Cold War, this will undoubtedly go down in history as amongst the more notable events of the last 200 to 300 years. So 21st century history is something that we are currently living through and will then be things that people will talk about and will review for many years to come. This will probably be a topic for discussion and study in schools as well as in history classes, no doubt. So if you look at our global pandemic, the rapid spread and the global reach of what we have actually experienced in terms of what we've discussed this before in a prior webinar topic, and this is now a recap over the next few slides. But if you look at what has happened with this global pandemic, it's spread around the world. It has had unprecedented effects on global economies and the way in which we've actually been able to trade. And if we look at what has happened to South Africa, we haven't emerged from this unscathed. Initially, we were under the radar, our numbers were fairly low. Over the past month and a half, we had actually sprung up into the top 5. We now seem to have gone down to 7th, and hopefully we will continue to move further down. This is one of those scales that you don't want to be very high up on. And hopefully, as we go forward into the future, the vaccine is probably going to be what will then ease global tensions and help us to open up trade again. But in the meantime, global uncertainty and disruption has actually been driven by pandemic and pandemonium around the pandemic. So without a vaccine or even trying to get to herd immunity, the fall in numbers will probably be temporary as global restrictions ease, as trade starts to open up, as global travel starts to get back to where it was again. I think it's going to be a while before we get there. But if you look at these graphics on the right-hand side, we actually look at what was happening initially from May into June, the numbers that started to go up dramatically and then started to ease off. And then, of course, in the US, there was this rebound. And from about June onwards, going about mid-June all the way up to the end of June, there was this massive rebound. And if we look now at the latest numbers that have been coming through, the massive rebound has started to ease off, and there's now this second leveling off. So basically what's been happening is something that I think is a global trend where as economies lock down, you tend to start to have a leveling off. But what happens is that as you start up again, unfortunately and invariably, you tend to have problems where people will start to look at easing up, then the restrictions ease, and then we think that we're out of trouble. And before you know it, the spread starts to happen again. The big problem with governance around these things is that governments have actually not been doing too well. So a lot of organizations, a lot of governments have been criticized for the manner in which they've been doing things. If you recall with Boris Johnson in the UK, even while the UK government was advocating that people socially distance, Boris Johnson and a few of his colleagues were actually going around shaking hands and still doing public meetings, etc., etc. And before you knew it, the Prime Minister had actually become a victim himself of COVID-19 and had actually spent time in hospital. So global leaders have actually not been setting the right example. And of course, the question that I asked down at the bottom is, would you trust any of these current government leaders to do the right thing? And right now, any government will not or cannot do what you'll have to do for yourself. It's a matter of us taking responsibility. Governments around the world, South Africa has been, I think, fairly straightforward in terms of what it's been saying, that masks are mandatory. Absolutely agree with that. This is not a matter for debate. If you go into a mall, if you're taking your children into a mall, if you're going to a restaurant, and if people around you are walking around without masks, you have every right to actually speak to them and say, listen, you're doing the wrong thing. You're being irresponsible. And this is not a time for civil liberties and saying that you have a right to free speech, etc., etc. COVID is not one of those things that you can actually negotiate with. So free speech doesn't even come into it. Your civil liberties, our civil liberties don't come into it. This is the time to be cautious and vigilant, and I will talk a little bit about that just later on. But ladies and gentlemen, going further into today's topic, there's lots of talk now about COVID-19 and what could have been done to prevent it, and how government should have acted better, and how corporations and society should have acted better. But the big question is, who saw it coming? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on today when we talk about some of the surveys that are taking place, especially one from the National Association of Corporate Directors, which is the America's equivalent of our own Institute of Directors in Southern Africa. And with the IOD, a lot of, as with all directorship institutes around the world, when you looked at what the people and organizations and directors saw as risks exactly 1 year ago, and if you compare it to now, COVID and pandemics wasn't even on the radar. One person who had been talking about it to a large extent was Bill Gates back in 2014. I'd urge you to go and have a look at the TED talk that he had given, which is deeply insightful, that was done a year later in 2015, where he talks about the fact that we are most likely to have highly infectious diseases affecting us, and no longer so much the threat of a world war, but more the spread of disease that is actually likely to affect how humanity is able to go forward. And of course, one of the interesting things that Bill Gates had actually talked about even earlier this year was that more work was done for military preparedness and funding of military preparedness, as opposed to actually taking or catering for a virus and emergency preparedness for around a virus. So basically, countries were waging war on the wrong front. So we are waiting for an attack to come through our borders by air, land, or sea, or even cyber attacks. And we have now been laid low by a virus, something that very few people had actually prepared for. In fact, no country in the world had actually effectively prepared for it. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we go out of the recap segment into our one of the key segments of the topic for today, which is from Disruptor to Saviour, how technology has played a role in this, I'd like us to actually run the next poll, please, Sarah. So, ladies and gentlemen, the business climate, economy, and work prospects have been deeply impacted by the pandemic. Which of the following do you think could help to create an environment of growth and prosperity beyond the devastation? Now, this was a poll that we had run almost a month ago in one of the first webinar topics in the series. So it'll be interesting to actually see what the views are today. So the question again, the business climate, economy, and work prospects have been deeply impacted by the pandemic. Which of the following do you think could help create an environment of growth and prosperity beyond the devastation? And the devastation I'm talking about here is COVID-19, of course. So first option, government stimulus package to large businesses to stop retrenchments and to create jobs. Second option is urgently developing entrepreneurs and the small business sector. And the third one is a one-off payment, example, 2,500 Rand to all South Africans by the government to stimulate economic activity. So there's no right or wrong answer here, but your view is important. So it'll be important to see what you say, what you have to say there. How are we doing on the poll so far, Sarah?
71% have voted. There's a few more, 74%.
Excellent. Please keep going, guys. It'll be interesting to see what your views are on this. How are we doing so far, Sarah?
We got 80%.
Excellent, excellent. Please keep going, guys. Let's aim for 100% here. And we're into the last 10 seconds or so. I'll do a 5-second countdown just now. So I really appreciate your input, ladies and gentlemen. And 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So we're going to close the poll and please share the results, Sarah. Thank you. Okay, so government stimulus packages to large businesses to stop retrenchments and create more jobs, that's 21%. And 79% have said urgently developing entrepreneurs and the small business sector. And of course, the one option which a few people had voted for previously, but almost nobody confirmed now, 0%, is the one-off payment of government to stimulate government economic activity. Excellent, very, very interesting. And it's very interesting to see how small businesses and entrepreneurs in the small business sector has in the last few months started to become an area that organizations are starting to look at very, very seriously. Even government has started to mention that this is an area that is actually vital for economic activity. It has played its role, especially during the lockdown, of being able to keep communities going, especially with food and essentials, etc., etc. And I'm pretty sure that this is likely to continue to the future. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for that input. We will be having two more polls before we close today. So, moving into technology from Saviour to Disruptor. Now, if you have to have a look at what has happened, and of course, quoting Bill Gates again from his 1995 book, The Road Ahead, he actually talked about how the internet would actually drive the way in which businesses, organizations, countries, and societies would change from the traditional business and the traditional way of doing things, which was a very high friction type of economy, to a friction-free economy. So, in other words, back in the early 90s, Microsoft and Bill Gates was already talking about how technology will facilitate a seamless migration from one mode of working to another. Now, when you talk about a friction-free economy, what you're talking about there is that previously, if you wanted, for instance, as an example, you're a small business, you wanted to start up, and you wanted to import footwear from, for instance, China, Malaysia, and Vietnam, bring it into South Africa, and then sell to your local retailers. If you wanted to start up that business years ago, you need to have land buildings, you need to have a telephone line, you need to employ people, you need to have storage space, etc., etc. With the friction-free economy, with the internet, with the ability to actually set up your own payment system, etc., etc., setting up an e-commerce platform, you basically, all you need is a website. You need just some electronic and telecommunications software and hardware, your computer, etc. You need a data line, and basically you're able to order from these economies elsewhere around the world. You could have these for the footwear brought into the country. Everything could be paid for seamlessly, and then you could actually have these items of footwear sent to your local retailers without you even having to store them or even look at them. So basically, that's the friction-free economy. You wouldn't need a business license. You wouldn't even need to employ people to do this. Maybe one or two people to help you to run your administration. But as opposed to starting a small business years ago, when you actually needed to hire for the same type of business, maybe 12 to 15 people, you could comfortably get by with one or two people or even three people now. That is what Bill Gates was actually talking about. The fact that one day, back in 1995, one day we were going to see this friction-free economy happening. And lo and behold, when COVID-19 hit, we've started to see exactly this type of thing happening. So with this little piece of data here that we've gotten from Gallup and an additional source via Statista, technology is actually recently seen as a disruptor, not turning into a savior. So in the United States, during the course of the lockdown, as COVID-19 started to really bite, virtual doctor visits had started to skyrocket. And whereas prior in similar periods in 2018 and 2019, where they'd seen a rise, but a very gradual rise, it had now started to increase very, very steeply. And during the course of this year, it had actually gone up dramatically. And basically, a lot of the participants in the survey that were actually surveyed say that they would actually prefer to continue doing this type of virtual visits more often, as opposed to actually seeing a doctor if it could be avoided. So what this is likely to do is it's likely to grow and evolve further, and it will be driven by technology and software and artificial intelligence. So as you can see, the businesses that have now started to migrate to this new mode of working is restaurants and delivery, curbside pickups, and your Mr. Deliveries and your takealot.com, etc., etc., virtual doctor visits and food delivery. So obviously, these types of things have now had an impact on the traditional businesses we were used to working in an office. Again, some research that was conducted recently into how willing are you to stay at home or go back to work, and of course, working remotely more often is now favored by 43% of participants. To maintain their former schedule is 35%, but work in the office more often, 12%, and already working remotely full-time is 8%. So a full 51% of people would actually prefer to actually move away from the way in which they had traditionally worked. 49% opting to actually, and of course, this is now with rounding, you would actually get a few percentage points here. So it doesn't exactly add up to 100%. But more and more people are now favoring a different way of working, especially in the pandemic. And even once the vaccine is found, it's a lot of people that will actually be willing to work from home. Colleagues at our offices in Santon have preferred to work from home. I prefer to work from home. I'm contactable by the office and via Zoom and Teams if I'm required, but I would prefer to work from home as far as possible and to engage with clients directly from here. But a lot of our people involved in technology development, technology rollout, etc., these are the types of people that will actually be more involved in working from home if they can. And then, of course, you will then have to have people sharing office space. You will have people with more social distancing. And so even once the vaccine comes in, and this is even from our own offices, people would prefer to work offline if they could, but stay contactable from home as far as possible and only come in for the essential meetings. So technology has absolutely played a role in that. And of course, the very medium that we're using now, which is Zoom, has actually seen activity rise dramatically. As discussed last week and in previous weeks, Zoom had actually said that they are 7 years ahead of the schedule that they were expected to be at. So Zoom didn't even expect to be in this position until 2026. So they've had to actually bring their business model forward, they've had to upgrade, they've actually had to go through massive amounts of redevelopment of their platform. As you could see, Zoom actually took a lot of flack earlier this year for having lack security. They've now encrypted their security. So this is an encrypted platform that we're now using, whereas technology wasn't as secure as it was before. But this is not Zoom's fault. It's just that technology now had to come to the fore to actually cater for something that was completely unexpected. As I discussed earlier, a lot of people, most of the people on the planet wouldn't have expected this type of thing to happen, but we had to adapt regardless. It was hard for us to adapt. It was heartbreaking because we now had all of these plans made throughout the course of this year for our businesses, and we had to now readapt to a different way of working. And technology has now helped us to actually move that forward. So if you have to look at this very interesting graphic, Zoom's performance and market value now outstrips the world's largest airlines. In effect, a technology platform has taken the place of people having to get on a plane to either do business travel or even for holidays. So what's been happening now is that as opposed to going overseas to meet with people at various geographic locales, if you run your business in that way, one of our partners in the firm also does the regular New York visits as well for other business interests that we have overseas. And none of that has been able to happen. And all of these things are now taking place virtually. So the technology platform has now replaced an airline in terms of how you actually perform a specific function. Obviously, this will go back to normal over a period of time, but in terms of where people feel that they will go now, in most organizations, business travel is only going to be done if it's absolutely necessary to do so. So, of course, in terms of key risks for 2020 and going into 2021 and beyond, ladies and gentlemen, lots of organizations and businesses are looking at business continuity, looking at IT and technology and disaster recovery, and looking at the way in which they reprioritize expenditure. 87.5% of organizations in the US, UK and Canada, and US, UK and Australia that were polled for this actually indicated that they'll spend as much as last year, if not more, on business continuity measures because they foresee that technology is now starting to play an extremely important role in scalability, flexibility, enabling organizations to pivot from one mode of working to another. If you look at the type of platform that we are using now, Zoom has been around for a long period of time. So is Skype for Business and other video conferencing platforms. We've only made it mandatory. We've only started to make it something worth doing as a result of having no other options to go for. So basically what's happened now is that while technology had always been about the hype and the promise in years gone by, very few people took it seriously until we had no choice but to use the technology platform. We were heavily continuing our business trips, traveling from one province to another, traveling from one town to another, visiting clients, etc. And we only pivoted to this way of working as a result of being pushed to do it when we had no other choice. So the point that I'm making here, ladies and gentlemen, is that leadership and our ability to assess risk and to plan ahead is crucial, but it's a strategic matter that is not just strategy in itself, but it's about how you actually lead in doing these things. How do you respond as you go forward? How do you redo your strategy? How do you actually re-strategize? And how do you move forward by listening to what's going on? And also understanding and asking a crucial question about what could kill yourself, your own and your small enterprise or your large business as a result of things that you hadn't anticipated before. And these are the types of things that will enable us to lead and to plan for the future. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it through two case studies coming up just now. But in terms of the post-pandemic economy, and moving into this next segment, and over here, ladies and gentlemen, the key, and this quote, you can never quote often enough. This is one of the famous quotes from Jack Welch, former CEO of General Electric. And what he had said before he had, around the time that he had embarked on changing the way in which General Electric had actually done business from the late 70s into the 80s and then into the mid 90s before he retired, was change before you have to. And never has this been more a truism than it is now. We've got to change, we've got to embrace change. And of course, these are the types of things that you discuss fairly often at business school. Constant change and adaptation is nothing new. It's been part of corporate education for quite a long period of time. But the pandemic, though, has been a stark reminder that we could easily become used to the way we will always do things. We might easily fool ourselves into thinking that we are constantly adapting when in fact we are actually just treading water. And what it's taught us is that devastation can actually force you to actually relook entire business models, strategies, supply chains, the way in which we work, the way in which we lead our people, the way in which we treat our people, how we incentivize our people, the types of environments in which we work. So this is now actually bringing us to thinking about how do we stay constantly vigilant. And ladies and gentlemen, this actually brings us to the case study. One of the first case study today is going to be one on Boeing just now, but a very, very quick one in terms of Nokia's fall from market dominance. Now, this graphic on the right, ladies and gentlemen, is what happened not very long ago. At one stage, Nokia was the most popular handset maker in the world. At one point, its market share was around the 50% mark. So 1 out of every 2 mobile phones in the world was a Nokia. However, something very, very interesting had happened. Something very interesting had happened to Nokia during the period from 2007 going into 2009. What had happened was that one of the ethnographers, a data scientist by the name of Trisha Wang, had actually gone into China, and she had actually conducted research on behalf of Nokia, but she wasn't doing it in the traditional way. She was actually listening to what people had to say. So basically, when she went from town to town and city to city in China, she went into the rural areas. What she had actually found that Nokia was actually a very, very highly prized mobile handset. However, very few people could afford it. And what had happened was that at this point in time, she started to realize that the market for mobile phones, for cell phones, for smart handsets was starting to grow, but Nokia needed to actually produce a more affordable piece of hardware and a more affordable solution, and it wasn't in that market space. So when she came back, she had actually produced a comprehensive report, and when she discussed this with Nokia's leadership, what had happened was they had actually said that, look, our big data actually tells us that we should actually stick with expensive phones for elite mobile users. We're not in the market that you're actually talking about, and we don't foresee that there's going to be actually huge growth in that area. And what had happened was that there was a heavy reliance in Nokia at the time on big data. So there was lots of artificial intelligence, decision-making models, etc., lots and lots of data that they crunched. And what had happened was that their data was telling them that, look, the market for mobile handsets and the highest margins come from the things that we're currently doing. Nokia is such a strong brand. There's no way in which you actually could have that market dominance challenged by upstarts such as Samsung and LG and Huawei at the time. At this point, if you remember, the iPhones were just starting to gain traction in the marketplace. And this was now just before the iPhone can actually take over the world by storm and change everything forever. And basically, on average, Nokia's market share had then dropped from 38% to just 3% in 7 years. So what had happened here was that this is an organization that had become so used to understanding and drinking its own Kool-Aid, but having its own people tell it how wonderful it was, that it was actually ignoring some vital data. And even though this data didn't fit with their original way of thinking, so if you look at the way I've represented it in this graphic here, they were looking at big data, which is large samples of very, very narrow pieces of data and taken from very, very large, high numbers of sources. So basically, it relies on machine learning. It's a very narrow range of data taken from lots of people. And what Trisha Wang had brought to them, their data scientists, was ethnographic research, which relies on human learning and it reveals a deep social context. And basically, what was happening was that people were actually telling you what they wanted and how they actually intended to use these devices into the future if they could afford them. And Nokia was listening to a completely different set of data that said that, look, if you keep doing what you're doing, and if this is how you're going to do it, then all you do is you focus in this narrow area and you just keep making better and better quality handsets in the same way that you've been doing before. The iPhone, the Samsung S Class, and the S Series, these are the things that have been on Huawei with the P Series have now started to take over the world. And that was it. Nokia could no longer sustain itself. As you know, it was bought out by Microsoft. They paid a premium for a business that was now at its height. And when the time came, they could no longer sustain this business. And eventually they had to sell it off and move out of that business. Nokia is now in the networking business. So it now does networking hardware and it provides networks, 5G networks, et cetera, globally. So it's no longer in the business that it was in. Now, you might have a case to say that, well, Nokia has evolved its business model and it moved on, but it had no choice in the matter. It was in a burning platform. It was actually in a place where it no longer could compete the way it had done before, and now it had to reinvent itself in a completely different space. If you think about one other company that had actually done this, well, if you remember Ericsson and Ericsson handsets in the late 90s, going into the early 2000s, and then it became Sony Ericsson, as Ericsson was actually starting to have exactly the same problem as Nokia. So the writing was on the wall for Nokia. It's not that it couldn't, it was the only one in its area doing this. It was, the writing was on the wall. It had ignored what had happened with Ericsson as well, as it actually then fell foul of competitors. So ladies and gentlemen, moving into a completely different industry, the airline industry, we all know what had happened with the Boeing 737 MAX 8 and the tragic incidents of the two plane crashes, one with the Ethiopian Airlines and the other with an Asian airline. It was tragic, and basically what had happened was that in this case, Boeing had decided to tweak an existing design that had been running since the 1960s. And what had happened was that as a result of years and years of profit stripping and trying to extract as much value from an existing business model without having to change much, they had actually been taking shortcuts in terms of profitability. If you look into, and this is a very good article covered by the Wall Street Journal as well, Boeing had actually for years and years had been boosting its profits and its balance sheet and its income statement and trying to look the financials look good. But this was a company in some very serious problems. You look at the 787 Dreamliner, it also had problems with batteries, etc. And this started to point to a problem in which Boeing had actually started, and when they realized that Airbus had actually had done a very good upgrade of its existing fleet and had actually smartly redesigned its competing model, the model that had competed with the 737, Boeing realized that it was going to be late to the party, and it decided to rush the development of the 737, put in new smart engines. But what it did is that it decided to tweak the existing design of its existing body to try and get away with problems. And what happened was during test flights, they found that the plane tended to become unstable during certain times of flight. And what had happened was that Boeing's designers then decided to resort to software in order to correct the in-flight problems that they were experiencing. And of course, if you look at this graphic on the right, the instability problems tended to become unpredictable, especially for pilots that weren't adequately trained on the new 737 MAX 8. And what had happened was that as they tried to correct the plane during flight when it made certain stability changes, they thought that something had gone wrong with the plane. Meanwhile, it was the software that was instructing the plane to behave in a certain manner, and the plane had actually started to behave in a way that was counter to how the pilots were actually flying the plane, and that's resulted in the two crashes. And that resulted in Boeing having to ground those planes. So basically what had happened was that Boeing, which was once a pioneer and a leader in aircraft technology and aircraft development, and was amongst the largest corporations of its type globally, was actually being hampered by quality, design, reliability issues. And basically, if you look deeper into how this organization had been functioning, it was a deeply troubled company, and it was one where they were starting to experience problems as a result of the shortcuts that they had taken years ago. And this is now something that they're starting to pay the price for. As you can see with the stats that have come out, Boeing has actually been a huge casualty of COVID-19 and the COVID-19 crisis. And if you look at what had happened, if you had to compare Airbus and Boeing, these are the two leaders in these industries. Their numbers have actually been fairly close to each other for many years. And if you look at aircraft deliveries, etc., going into 2020, the Boeing MAX 8 saga has hit Boeing badly, and is less than half of the deliveries that Airbus will be taking or will be delivering to customers in the same period of time. So bad reputation and a poor culture and the big governance problems that you have and the poor leadership problems that you have in the organization are starting to hurt. Boeing had been obsessed with cost cutting and shortcuts and short-term profitability, and it's now facing a steep battle to actually get back to where it was. And of course, if you think that it's just one CEO and a short period of time over which it's happened, please have a look at the Wall Street Journal, where they'd actually been talking about previous CEOs prior to Dennis Muilenburg, who had actually been doing exactly the same thing that he'd been doing. Dennis Muilenburg was asked to step down earlier this year as well, and the incoming CEO now faces an uphill battle. But if you look at the challenges that he has, he looks at it and says that, well, we need to now start thinking long term, or this business won't survive. And so these all have implications across industries and across organizations. So this is the type of thinking in large organizations. It also afflicts smaller organizations and even the one-man business. So basically, these types of things cut across industries, and it's all down to human behavior. So, ladies and gentlemen, before I get into the next segment, we are going to be taking a next poll, please, Sarah. And if there are any questions, you're welcome to raise your hand. But we're actually not far from the end of today's webinar, so we're going to go into the Q&A just now. So you're most welcome to actually start asking. There are some questions. I'm just going to go through some of the comments. No comments so far. So Sarah, if we can just please run the poll, and then we'll go from there, and then we will then go into elements of a new economy. So ladies and gentlemen, in terms of this poll question, if another pandemic or similar disaster hits in the next 2 years, I aim to lead my business organization with the following mindset. So the options are, take it as it comes, each person for themselves. Option 2 is, it will be a struggle, but I'll cope somehow. Option 3, I'm planning for the future and it's a team effort. Or option 4, why should I care? It's the government's problem to look after us. So this is a very interesting one. It will be very interesting to see what your thoughts are on this, ladies and gentlemen. So how are we doing on the polls, Sarah?
We have 53% have voted.
Keep going, guys. I think we'll be able to get there. Be nice to hear from you on what you think on that. How are we doing now? We'll go into a 10-second start down. Countdown, sorry.
62%, 65.
65%. While you're doing that, I'm just going to read out from Nomapa. It has introduced us to the world we have never expected to be during COVID-19. Many have achieved a lot in terms of knowledge as far as is beyond accessible. Many have achieved a lot in terms of knowledge as is far beyond accessible to all. From Facebook, this is Nomapa from Facebook. Nomapa, thank you very much for that. So, how are we doing? I think we'll go into a 5-second countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll end the poll there. Can we share the results, please? So, ladies and gentlemen, 4% say, I'll take it as it comes, each person for themselves. 19% say, it'll be a struggle, but I'll cope somehow. And a 77% are saying, I'm planning for the future and it's a team effort. And of course, nobody has gone for why should I care? It's the government's problem to look after us. So, ladies and gentlemen, very, very interesting. Thank you very much for your contribution. So, very much we can already see that there's a large percentage of people that are saying that, look, no matter what comes along in future, we're going to adapt, we'll go forward, we need each other, we'll figure out how to go forward with this. So, thank you very much for that. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we go into the last segment, which is addressing life cycles, any business will have a life cycle. It could be your business, it could be your products, it could be services, it could be the technologies that actually run these businesses. And in fact, you need all of these to actually run a successful business. The key thing about any of these is that they go through life cycles. So you will start up a business, you will start up with a new piece of technology, you will produce a new product or service, and you'll get it into the marketplace. And what will happen is that it will achieve success for a fair period of time. But basically what happens is that, as with your business and with others, your competitors are also producing certain types of value. And they'll be producing other types of products and services, and they will be upgrading their systems and technology as they grow as well. So basically what happens is that your business will go through a certain life cycle. It'll hit the introduction stage, it'll go into growth, and then you will start to experience great growth and profitability, and it starts to become really successful. But as with any business, product or service or technology, it starts to hit a certain level where it tapers off and you reach maturity. And it's during these times that you'd be thinking about what's your next. Lots of organizations, and as we've seen with Nokia and with Boeing, have been very, very successful. Nokia had operated in the first two segments for many, many years, and was actually was one of the, at one point in history, was actually amongst the most popular brands in the world. If your product is now getting to 1 out of every 2 people who actually choose a mobile phone, and if they're more likely to choose a Nokia than any other product, it tells you a lot about how popular that product was. But what had happened with Nokia, what had happened with Sony Ericsson, what had happened with Ericsson mobile phones, what had happened with Boeing, was that they had actually reached a stage in their life cycles where they had become so successful, so profitable, and after a while complacent, that certain other types of imperatives started to take off. So during this time, when the organization needed to renew itself, a lot of internal wrangling would have taken place within the board, with shareholders, with venture capitalists, with financiers, etc., etc. And a lot of them would actually be coming with their own agendas. A lot of organizations would be saying that, well, we now need to actually extract maximum profit out of this. The shareholders in the market want a higher share price. You need to be cutting costs, etc., etc. And ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you this in terms of a lot of the large organizations, especially listed organizations that we work with, short-term thinking sets in and hurts a business like you cannot believe. So once you list an organization on a stock exchange, it belongs to the shareholders and it belongs to the marketplace. So what happens then is that people are looking at quarterly earnings. They're no longer looking at your long-term plans for the organization. All they're caring for, especially if you have institutional investors such as pension funds and people such as an Allen Gray or Coronation, etc., etc., is that all these organizations are looking for is what return can you give me now? How can you cut your costs? How can you keep your financials in line? Very few organizations are saying, well, tell us about your future plans. If they do tell you or want to know about your future plans, all they're really interested in is paying lip service to it. Most organizations want you to perform consistently from year to year financially, but that often means that management will be tempted to take shortcuts as opposed to saving money and preparing for the long term. So very few organizations are able to balance this. As markets grow, as people watch out for their competitors and say, well, our competitors are performing at this level, so we need to get there. This is a temptation for leadership in organizations to look at it and say, well, we need to do the same. And what happens is that when you have a turnover of boards and CEOs, that perpetuates the problem. Because what happens is that the CEO that's currently there says, well, it's not my problem. I'll leave it for the next guy. I kick the can down the road. I get maximum profitability. I cut the costs. I go on to Bruce Whitfield's show. I go on to 702 or any of the business programs, and I go on to Business Day Live and Bloomberg, and I actually tell them about how wonderfully we've done over the last year. And we talk up our prospects for the future year, knowing full well that in 2 years' time, I'm not going to be here. And then the next guy that comes in must then sort out the problems. All I'm here to do is to get my bonuses. I need to incentivize the company, keep the share price up, etc., etc. That's how you have organizations that end up being in a disaster. That's when you tend to have organizations that say, well, we can't sustain ourselves. We never thought about the future. So if another pandemic had to hit in another 5 years, and you've been doing this to your large listed organizations now, the chances are it's going to struggle, it's going to retrench, it's going to cut stores, it's going to have to find ways to actually keep things going. And if you look at, for instance, Edgar's and the Edgar's Group, Edcon, and if you look at how profitable Edcon was in the 80s and the 90s, and when it started to get taken over by Bain Capital, then moved into the 2000s, and it started to move from owner to owner, and then had to eventually delist itself. It's been a company that's been struggling to keep itself afloat, and now stores are closing all over the place. These are the challenges that you have as leadership in an organization. So if this is an organization that failed to change before it had to, that couldn't cope in times of upheaval, the pandemic is actually just going to make things worse for an organization such as that, and it's going to then rely on government bailouts in order to get it further. These types of organizations then are unable to be sustainable into the future. And ladies and gentlemen, the point that we're making here is that never allow systems and products and business life cycles to atrophy. You've got to change before you have to. You've got to see change coming. You're going to have to take those very crucial decisions right up front to stay ahead of the curve. Because if you don't change before you have to, and if you're not talking to your partners and vendors early, you're going to hit big problems. So in any organization, you've got to assess everything with a big picture mindset. What are our new projects coming in? What does the long-term future look like? What is the current portfolio of projects and products looking like? Do I have any good products in there that are worth salvaging? Do I need to look at my people and understand when I look at my people and understand what they're saying, how many of them actually making sense, or how many of them are actually in short-term thinking? I need to make some honest assessments about where this business is going into the future to keep this business alive and well. Sometimes you may have to take some very tough decisions, as Mr. Andre De Ruyter has done at ESCOM, where he's walked on to the ESCOM, two ESCOM power stations and said that, look, I've given you 3 months to change. You guys are not doing your jobs. He suspended 2 general managers, and now 2 new general managers will come in. And he's looking at this and saying, as a management team, this is where we need to be. If we don't turn this thing around, the business will not survive much longer. And other competitors will eventually come into a market that the government will deregulate. And this is going to be the end of ESCOM. These are the types of things that any business will need to be looking at. So ladies and gentlemen, where to from here? How do you plan for the next 1, 2, or 3, or 5 years? Have you decided to move away from physical offices with teams working from home? How do you price your products? How do you price your new way of doing business? So these are the types of things that organizations will look at. If you were used to pricing your business in one way, obviously you cannot do this as you move away from that. Now, how do you now price as you go into the future? So pricing is absolutely vital. If you've never done research before, how do you do it now? Are you reading widely? Are your people and your teams reading widely? Are you on the same page in terms of how you need to move forward into the future? Do you look at things such as journals such as Scientific American that cover a wide range of areas and topics around change and human behavior and even scientific developments that are happening globally? Do you get your people to read widely? If you're not, where are you getting your perspective from in terms of the future? Lots of organizations will call up a B2HA and say, listen, tell us what's going on out there. Guide us on how things are happening. Guide us on what needs to happen into the future. And if we have problems within the organization that we are missing, come and guide us on how to fix these things as well. So who are you and your organizations talking to at this point in time in order to do these things? Because corporate landscapes are now going to be changing, ladies and gentlemen. So the new global economy is going to be looking more at localized manufacture. If you look at some of the stats that are coming out of global organizations, a lot more of them intend leaving China and localizing their manufacture in their home country of origin, or they're planning to move it to other areas and other geographically dispersed areas where they can manufacture, such that if COVID hits, they're able to get better access to the goods that they actually want to manufacture for their home markets. You're going to be seeing less globalization, and you're going to be seeing more localization. There are going to be opportunities for small, medium, and micro enterprises, as you can see with your own input today. A lot more people see that the value of small, medium, and micro enterprises is starting to grow dramatically. The gig economy will have to structure differently. One of the huge casualties of COVID-19 was that gig workers have actually started to suffer dramatically. And what had happened was that a lot of them had actually lost opportunities and were struggling. In the UK, a lot of gig workers were struggling to pay the rent, and government bailouts had to help them. So this came as a shock to an economy or a part of the global economy that was actually evolving fairly quickly. And of course, as you work from home and as you have greater worker mobility, greater emphasis on technology, etc., cybercrime is going to grow grow dramatically. Because what's going to happen is that there's going to be a greater emphasis on digitization of banking and financial services. Cloud computing and robotics is going to start seeing huge increases and huge investments. And of course, healthcare, as you've seen with virtual doctor visits, etc., we've already started to see huge increases in those areas. So ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude, I just wanted to share a few closing thoughts before we go into the Q&A for you. And we're going to come back to these just now. But if you look at the National Association of Corporate Directors in the US, 12 months ago, they were asked in 2019, what 5 trends do they foresee having the greatest impact on their companies over a following 12-month period? And if you look at the things that they identified, here's what's now the standard fare. If you look at large organizations in the UK, in Europe, in South Africa, in Asia, if you look at the large corporates, this was pretty much fairly consistent in terms of what they saw. Changes in regulatory climates, economic slowdowns, cybersecurity threats, business model disruptions, which could be linked to COVID, but no one had actually ever talked about COVID-19 or a pandemic threat bringing entire global economies to a halt. So nobody actually saw this coming. So very few people could actually predict accurately what was likely to happen in 2020, let alone going into 2021 and 2022. And I can tell you now, lots of large organizations, insurers and reinsurers, etc., are starting to see exactly the same. So basically, the types of traits that you will need from your own, from yourself as a leader and from your leadership in your organizations are on how do you actually address good governance to make sure that these organizations are now starting to address these companies into the future, these company challenges, organizational challenges into the future. So a lot of organizations have actually started to look at what strategy was all about and where it needs to be, performance, risk, and compliance. But what are the inputs into those? You need to have certain behavioral traits as leaders. In other words, the integrity, competence, responsibility, accountability, fairness, and transparency. This is referred to as the iCraft traits of leadership. And of course, your human behavior as a business, as a leader, as organizations, as teams, you need to have certain types of behavioral traits in terms of your attitude, motivation, maturity, and discipline, in terms of how you strategize and how you improve organizational performance, and how you address risks and try to foresee what's coming along, and how you comply with the law as you go into the future. So ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude there, I'd like to leave you with the last quote, was make your friends before you need them. This was actually a very, very interesting quote from Ethel Barrymore, an American actress. And she actually came up with this very interesting quote, which I think has huge traction now. And as we go into Q&A, I'd like to actually take the last poll, please, and then we'll go into the Q&A, and then Sarah's going to open up the mics. So Sarah, that last poll, my mindset has changed since the start of the pandemic. You can choose more than one option here. So well, how has your mindset changed since the start of the pandemic? First option is, the future is hectic. I foresee a very bleak 2021. Or I'm nervous but cautiously optimistic about the future. 3 is, I feel a lot more confident now than a few months ago. And 4, change before you have to. It's important to have a proactive and positive mindset. Even if the future is bleak, I'll adapt. So you can choose more than one option here, ladies and gentlemen. So it'll be interesting to see what you say about this. How are we doing so far, Sarah?
We have 34% have voted, 37. Okay, it's jumping quite quickly, 44 now, 48.
Excellent. Please keep going, ladies and gentlemen. It'd be nice to have everyone participate in this one. This is the last poll. And then we'll go into our Q&A and the fireside chat. And while we're waiting for the numbers to come in, this is now one more interesting webinar that's coming up from UKZN on the 15th of September. So I'd urge you to actually visit this one and attend this one. It's by Professor Siska Fields, and it's around using creativity and innovation to solve wicked problems. So please take note of that, and please register early for it. I'm pretty sure that there need to be high numbers for that one as well. So how are we doing with the numbers so far, Sarah?
We have 82% have voted.
Okay, 82%. Let's keep going, guys. Let's aim for 100% here. There's a large number of you, so let's just see if we can get numbers going for that. And of course, some free advertising. UKZN is hosting a board leadership program on the 14th and I think the 15th of September, Sarah.
Yes, that's correct.
So that's very, very interesting. And Sarah will tell you more about that, the details on the site as well. Please do register. It's an exciting program, and I'm pretty sure that you will find great value from it as well. I will be one of the facilitators, number of excellent speakers talking about board governance, leadership, some of the challenges that will be facing leaders as we go into the future and how you can talk through these. I'll be sharing a lot of perspective with you from a lot of the large organizations that we're dealing with, the Reserve Bank, et cetera, and what they were feeling about where things are headed into the future. So I'll be sharing a lot of detail around that. So please attend if you can, and please look at the UKZN website on it. So Sarah, what's our numbers like?
86%.
86. So I'll go into a 5-second countdown, ladies and gentlemen, and then we'll close and share the poll, and then we'll do the Q&A. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And we're going to close the polls and we'll share the results, please, Sarah. So, ladies and gentlemen, 37% have said, I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm nervous, but cautiously optimistic about the future. 59% have said, I feel a lot more confident now than a few months ago. And another 59% have said, change before you have to. It's important to have a proactive and positive mindset. Even if the future is this bleak, I'll adapt. So 0% have actually said the future is hectic. I foresee a bleak 2021. So in true South African spirit, ladies and gentlemen, we're very resilient. South Africans are known to be resilient innovators and inventors. And I think our true spirit is starting to show through over there. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending. And we will now go into our fireside chat. And we will now take Q&A. So I'd love to hear from you on what your thoughts are. So can we open up the mics, please? And we'll go into the chat, please, Sarah.
Okay, so if anyone would like to ask a question live, you're welcome to raise your hand and we'll open up your mic. Otherwise, if you prefer to just type a question, you can either type that in the Q&A box or the chat box. I just have some comments that have come through. Simon says, excellent webinar. Thank you, Marlon and colleagues. Ruan says, interesting. And then you had that comment from Facebook that you did read out from Norma Pa. It has introduced us to the world we've never expected to be during COVID-19. Many have achieved a lot in terms of knowledge as is far beyond accessible to all. So that was from watching live on Facebook. Cecilia has asked if, good day, please, may we have the recording? So yes, we will send out a link once we have uploaded it onto our site, and then you'll have access to the recording.
And I see Ernest has raised his hand.
Okay. And then just another comment from Donzi, missed starting time. Is it possible to get the link to this webinar? Again, yeah, we will send out that link. That hand has gone down. I don't know if it was an accident.
Ernest, and then Ernest is welcome to speak.
Fanon is raised.
Shall we give Ernest an opportunity first, and then we'll get to Fanon?
That hand is not, Fanon is the only hand that's up. So if you'd like to ask your question, Fanon, you're welcome to unmute your mic.
Yes.
Oh.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
My name is Fanon Kihu. My question is, clearly from your presentation, more people prefer to work remotely than before the COVID-19. Does this mean that we are likely to see more people move away from urban areas or towns, maybe to rural areas? Thank you.
That's a very interesting question. It's hard to say right now that would actually result in move away or de-urbanization, as it were. I think that what's happening right now is that the trend has been more towards people saying, I prefer to stay at home as opposed to coming into an office to work. However, that also means that if you prefer to work from fairly distant, if you're a remote worker if you'd prefer to work from a different location, that's now going to be possible. I'm not really sure as to whether it will result in more people moving into rural areas, but what it does mean is that more people from rural and outlying areas will have access to being able to do work in the future with organizations based in cities and built up in urban areas. So what would happen there is that this is likely to create more opportunities for people that were previously remote or previously that were unable to access these as a result of being not being able to move into urban areas. So it opens up new opportunities for people that previously had no choice but to, for instance, move from KwaZulu-Natal to Johannesburg, or from Limpopo to Johannesburg to find new opportunities. If you are actually vigilant enough, if you have something or a service or a business or a product of value, you're now able to reach to markets that were previously closed off to you because people actually chose to have physical contact before talking, face-to-face contact. So opportunities will open up, but it doesn't necessarily mean that more people will move away. It's hard to say at this point in time, but what's happening is that now a wider world is now opened up, more opportunities. You now have access to more entrepreneurs and people with ideas that you'll be able to hear from than previously was possible as a result of the technology. I'd like to get Ernest unmuted, and Ernest, you're most welcome to talk. Sarah, if you can, I did see his hand up, so I think he just raised it. So go ahead. The hand is raised again. So Ernest, go for it.
Ernest, if you can just okay, I think yeah.
Yes, I can. I hope you can hear me now. All what I would like, if you can show the details, the contact details again. That would be great. The slide, that's the one. Yes. So we can make a picture of it.
Okay, this is the UKZN contact details, eh?
That's just fine. I'm from there as well, so you are my neighbor.
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. We had I don't know if it was Celestia, or was it Fanon again? Somebody had a hand raised. I think Ernest has got his hand up again. Nope.
No. Just in the meantime, I am going to launch the final poll where you can rate the webinar. But please, if you have any other questions, you can obviously raise your hand or you can type a question. I do have a comment from Zanele. Hi, thanks for this webinar. It has really opened my eyes.
Zanele, thank you very much. Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen? This is your time now. This is your fireside chat. So any questions that you would like to just raise your hand and Sarah will unmute your mic, or you're welcome to type it into the chat and we'll pick it up there as well. So please go for it.
I see we have 59% have voted, 61. Okay. I think if you do think of another question that you can't think of at the moment, you are still welcome to get in contact with us, and we can always forward these questions on to Marlon. When we do send out the mailer this afternoon, there is an opportunity where you can click for more feedback or comments, and you can always send your questions through there and we can pass them on to Marlon.
And of course, ladies and gentlemen, you're most welcome to look me up on LinkedIn, and you're most welcome to make contact there as well. It'll be good to hear from you. We do have something coming in on Q&A. Munene, thank you for this presentation. It's interesting and given me perspective on thinking on leadership. Thank you for that. And I see two more have come through on the chat. Yeah, you can read those out if you wish, Sarah.
Okay, we just have Innocent says, just to say thank you. The webinar was resourceful to me. Thank you for this initiative. And this is from Innocent from Uganda. Zilly says, awesome webinar. Thank you very much. Yeah, so thank you for all your comments and your feedback, and thank you to Marlon for presenting today. Obviously, you've provided us with a lot of interesting facts and a lot to think about. So hopefully we'll all
do
be
a quick round, the last round around the table before we head off. So going once, going twice, ladies and gentlemen. If there are any other questions you might have, you're most welcome to raise your hand now or to put it in the chat.
We do have a question that has come through. I think Rian, will the health and fitness industry make a comeback or entirely close their doors due to affected profits?
Good question. I miss going to the gym myself, and I think Virgin Active has actually struggled with this, but they're working hard to actually start to figure out how they're going to get people into a gym without everybody being in one place at the same time. Gyms, as you know, the popular ones here in Houghton in Johannesburg, old days used to be crowded, and it's a very popular gym. And people are going to have to be much more careful now about the time they spend in the gym. And of course, you're going to find people saying that the guy next to me is not got his mask on. What do I do? Do I call the gym manager? And someone says that, well, the person next to me is perspiring. What do I do about it? Well, ladies and gentlemen, very interesting industry, very difficult times at this point in time. I do think that they will find a way to come back. I think that they will find a way. These gyms have invested a lot in their assets, etc., over the years. So you're going to find that the health industry, you will find casualties. Certain of the smaller gyms, I think certain of the gyms that were unprofitable, even in the Virgin stable and Planet Fitness, will probably close down, but they will consolidate. And I think that what would happen is that with most businesses, ladies and gentlemen, even restaurants, you'll find that certain popular restaurants have started to close down. If you've been to Sandton Square, and if you've seen that some long-standing restaurants that were establishments, Trumps, etc., have now started to close. I mean, these were businesses that were constantly busy. There was never a day that I'd never ever seen Trumps not busy in Sandton Square. It's now gone, along with a couple of other businesses. They will refinance, they will recapitalize, and they'll find their way back. Or you will find other businesses that wish to enter this market that will then find the finance and that will start up. So you're already starting to see the green shoot. Businesses that had closed down are now starting to find replacements. I had actually spoken to an entrepreneur. I don't know if you know the Greenside Cafe, which has been a vegetarian institution here for the past 11 or 12 years. They had actually recently closed their restaurant. I know the owner, and he said that, look, his business had gone up 71% on the manufacturing side of things such as tofu and other vegetarian products. So he said that it was more profitable for him to be there. So he closed it, and he's now sold it off to a company called Fussy Vegan in Greenside. So please give them a shout when you're here in the next month or two. There was some free advertising for them. But basically what he says is that they're now in the restaurant business. I'm more in the food services industry. I'm more into manufacturing of food products. So that's where I see myself. So what he's done is that he's recapitalized his business, and he's actually changed it to being in a different. So he's got his business model is now different. He says that he'd love to be in a restaurant again at some point. If COVID hadn't hit, he would have probably still been there, but it opened his eyes now to realize that, well, there's one business that's doing well and there's another that's eating cash. He's going to push money into areas that are now not chewing cash and that are generating returns for him, and that's where he's going to be. This is the type of thing that you're going to see more and more in a lot of businesses, how they pivot from one way of working to another. He says he's now going to be a platform. He's going to have his platform. You go online, you order, you will have the products delivered to Pick and Pay or to Spar or wherever it is, and this is where his business is. That's how organizations have started to change. So coming back to it was a little bit of a long-winded answer to your question, but in terms of how a Virgin Active is likely to work, they're going to have to change the way they do business. There's not a lot they can do. They're actually in the physical, they're in a business with physical bricks and mortar assets. That's the nature of their business. So basically, they're going to have to figure out how to change from there. That's how they will go into the future. So lots of businesses are going to have to change the way they did things in the past. Ladies and gentlemen, I haven't talked about cloud kitchens, but what's happening now is that you have outsourced kitchens where people actually produce only food, and all they do is produce food and they make to order, and then it's delivered by Uber Eats or Mr. D, etc., to you. It's a growing phenomenon around the world. Cloud kitchens have started to take off phenomenally around the world. So basically, all people do is they hire out space, They have a kitchen. They work in a kitchen. Those kitchens will then, you can actually see how your food's being prepared. Some restaurants are actually having cameras where they say, this is how your order is being prepared. This is how cleanly we work in these environments. We follow all of the rules. We are hygienic about what we do. We disinfect regularly. So you can actually watch how your food's being prepared. And this is how a cloud kitchen will work as you go into the future. So these are the types of businesses that are coming up as a result of a pandemic devastating the way your previous business worked. So it's a matter of shifting and pivoting to a new way of doing things.
Okay, thank you, Marlon. We just have two more comments, and then we're going to close. So Innocent says, will we get the summary of today's webinar? And this is from Innocent from Uganda. So you will get a link to the video, and you'll also get access to the slides. So that's what you will get after today. Susan says, excellent webinar, learned a lot. Thanks, Marlon and team. Monica says, thank you, very informative. And this is from Monica from Zimbabwe. Yeah, so thank you again, everyone.
We've had quite a few people from all around. We've had people from as far away as Uganda as well, Sarah. It's actually interesting. We had a very, very good turnout today. That was excellent. And thank you to everybody for attending. I really do appreciate the time that you've taken this morning. As I said, please look out on the UKZN website for the board leadership program that's coming up and other interesting webinars that will be coming up in the next few weeks.
Okay,
and
thank
look me
you.
up on LinkedIn, please, ladies and gentlemen. Make contact. I look forward to seeing you on LinkedIn.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us and engaging in our webinars. As I did mention, the video and the slides will be available on our website. So we'll send out this link to you as soon as it's ready. Next week, we have our webinar on the 15th of September, using creativity and innovation to solve wicked problems. And that will be facilitated by Professor Ziska Fields. Also, if you enjoyed this learning area, as Marlon mentioned, we do have a board leadership program that will be commencing next week. You can find out more about this program and all of our programs on our website, which is www.ukznextendedlearning.com. So otherwise, we hope that you enjoyed the session today. Stay safe and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everybody. Keep well.